So, right, okay, we've got a piece of, there's a piece of knitting involved in this presentation. It's a history of disability and art education, performed as the unravelling of a knitting pattern, aka it seemed a good idea at the time. As I've just mentioned this to David, I could hear him thinking like, oh no, just read the stuff, just talk about the book, but it'll be evident. So I've got a piece of knitting. This was my rehearsal piece. So as I've rehearsed the talk, I've knitted, and what I'm going to do now is to unravel my knitting. I'm assisted by Erin, who's going to, you know, she's going to get that into a nice ball of wool by the end of it. So, without further ado, so let me just, is my 20 minutes starting now? I'm going to do a Tanya and go, yeah. I'm going to go over by, how many? I'm not going to go over. Okay, so the image included in the opening slide here represents a practice-based response to early archival work for a forthcoming book, A History of Disability and Art Education. For the purposes of this presentation, it reflects the metaphorical interlacing of theoretical perspectives from disability studies with histories of educational and institutional practices in art, craft and design, in an attempt to retrieve disability as a dropped stitch or a hole in established historical accounts of art education. The image here shows a knitted piece based loosely on an archival photograph of a plaster cast of the brain and cortex of Laura Bridgman, pupil and later teacher at Perkins School for the Blind, who following her early death in 1889 became the object of scientific study. Laura Bridgman entered Perkins School at the age of 7 after losing her sight and hearing, a consequence of childhood illness. Her ability to learn to read and write brought fame for her and the school director, Samuel Gridley Howe, who was able to demonstrate the effectiveness of his methods as he worked with her directly fingerspelling into her palm. Kimberly French, in her History of Perkins School, includes a photograph of a piece of Bridgman's delicate lacework, explaining that Laura's mother had taught her to knit before she became a student at Perkins. Although Bridgman is represented as largely incapable of communicating prior to her time at school, there must have been sufficient interaction with her mother or other family member for her to learn to sew and knit. This form of familial education and her undoubted ability to learn through and with materials, as well as her family's ability to teach through these forms, is passed over in a narrative that prioritises the role of the school in bringing Laura into a literate world. Where Blindness Takes Us, in this case, is to the beginning of the book, Casting On. Every mark counts. Value is at the heart of this project, the value we attribute to art education and the differential value attributed to disabled people in past and present times. The significance we place on subjects, people as well as curricula, can lead to their elevation or disqualification, their celebration or avoidance, their preservation or ruin. Whilst art education may have had a long association with inclusivity, its histories have left disability as a marginal or special interest. This isn't part of the performance, I'm just having a quick drink. Sorry about that, was it? It was the best bit. Somebody said it was the best bit. Keep that bit in next time you do it. I explore a number of reasons for its omission, including critical avoidance, the perceived irrelevance of disability, the dominance of needs-based discourse, the fragmentation of hierarchical histories and linguistic variations. In particular, I highlight the continued absence of disability in the light of contemporary revisionist histories of art education. We might argue that creative practices inherent in art education can resist taken for granted assumptions about what bodies and minds can be and do. Yet education is determined by cultural and societal preferences that prioritise those with so-called typical bodies and minds. Art education is not immune to such presumptions, since it too can reproduce and reinforce normative and ableist practices. In part, this is a consequence of educational systems that are as hostile to the subject of art education as the individuals it excludes. Yet ableist assumptions are embedded in creative as well as institutional practices, exclusions that are illustrated and reproduced by the absence of critical perspectives on disability in its histories. The book is in two parts and offers a sustained, if very partial, exploration of the relationship between disability and art education, revisiting past intersections in order to reflect on its contemporary and future relevance. Knit 1. Work for 5 chapters. 1. Crafting ocular normativity. That's why I didn't want to use that term, David, because I can't say it. Crafting ocular normativity, the dominance of vision, recognises the particular influence of industrial capitalism on the establishment of educational structures and processes in art education during the 1800s. More specifically, it examines the dominance of particular ideas about vision and visuality. Ocular normativity is employed here as a key concept to support a reading of 2 key texts. The first, Pioneers and Perseverance, Michael Royden's History of the Royal School for the Blind, here in Liverpool, and the Perkins School for the Blind, a book by Kimberly French. A main argument centres on the combined effects of ocular normativity and the emergence of new literacy practices that have contributed to a hierarchical relationship between design, fine art and craft. The chapter discusses the priority of vision over blindness, fine art over craft, and the supremacy of literacy in evolving systems of education. 2. Curating deafness. Aesthetics and the politics of display explores the dominance of normative ideas regarding beauty, goodness and taste. The discussion here centres on the collective exhibit of Schools for the Deaf at the World's Columbian Exhibition in Chicago in 1893, which showcased the role that the visual and mechanical arts played for children who were deaf. Whilst evidencing their segregation and supposed rehabilitation, the exhibition offered a mediated space for contact, positioning art educators and their pupils as actors within our histories of art education. However, the particular emphasis on the civilizing role of the arts for so-called savage races of Indigenous Americans and deaf children prompts an alternate reading of the moral purpose of an aesthetic art education at this time. 3. Erasing identity, eugenics and IQ. This explores the relationship between art education, disability and a eugenic logic. Eugenics had a significant influence on British culture, with keen support from numerous artists, writers and intellectuals in the early 1900s. While the turn of the century brought the prospect of universal access to art education, it did so within the context of exclusion, since a eugenic logic created a rationale for the segregation of children classified as feeble-minded. The concept of universality, so widely cited in previous histories of art education, refers instead then to a partial inclusion and one which prioritised apparently typical cognitive abilities. This narrative of a universal art education therefore confirms an act of erasure. Accounts at the turn of the century show a subject struggling to maintain its status within the curriculum, yet institutional practices in the arts appear to offer a means of redemption, humanising those otherwise disqualified on the grounds of their perceived cognitive incapacity. 4. A belief in the artistic capabilities of children is pursued in a further chapter, Child Art, the Making of Normative Youth. This explores the enduring influence of child art and the child art movement in the early 1900s and questions its contribution to a normative concept of childhood. Whilst accounts celebrate the child's early years as a time for individual creative expression, histories of segregated education reflect a preoccupation with functional development of the disabled child in preparation for a productive future. Such historical accounts contribute to the reinforcement of ableist assumptions regarding what it means to be a child, potentially obscuring disabled childhoods. The chapter draws on two examples, the Heritage Craft School in Chailey, East Sussex, and the Oscar Helene Home in Berlin, Germany, in order to examine the normative divide between creative individual expression in art and the utility of craft education for physically impaired children. 5. Psychology. Troubling the art education therapy nexus. This recognises the significant influence of psychology on art education and disability. While psychology suggests a wide field, in particular application to child study and the emergence of child-centred pedagogies in the early 20th century makes this a central preoccupation in histories of art education. Psychological methods were fundamental to the identification of age-related drawing schema, for example, developed in Britain by James Sully. I take a line from his early investigations in the 19th century through to the application of psychology to art education in the mid-20th century by Victor Lowenfeld, offering a discussion of his psychological explorations of haptic and visual types in research involving visually impaired young people. I move then to Lowenfeld's later work, which extolled the virtues of art education therapy for disabled young adults. Here I examine the role of psychology in the production of normalising discourses in art education. I argue, however, that a more nuanced reading of Lowenfeld's work reflects his capacity to learn from disability. Part 2. Reduce stitches, knit two together, knit two for 3 chapters. Part 2 opens with containing curricula, regulation and agency, an examination of curriculum, regulation and assessment in England in the 1980s. Attempts to defend and redefine art education reflected a knowledge of models from the past, its contemporary relevance and an openness to future uncertainty. Whilst there were concerns regarding the structural limitations imposed by a new national curriculum, advocates pointed towards a localised power of practice where art teachers could at last exert agency. I argue that these representations of art education characterise a subject poised to embrace a social orientation towards disability that was advocated by US art educator Doug Blandy. However, the introduction of a single category of special educational needs in Britain reinforced a needs rather than rights-based approach, rendering critical perspectives on disability as peripheral to curriculum revisions at that time. 7. Inclusive education. Displacing contemporary art practice. Discusses international objectives for social, educational and political change. A move towards inclusive education challenged the segregation of children and young people whilst promoting a more diverse teaching body. This chapter therefore brings a reading of inclusion together with arguments for bringing contemporary art practice into school art education via the role of the artist teacher. It offers examples from John Darby and J.T. Eisenhower, disabled people as artist teachers who provoke alternate renderings of mental disability through autopathography and autoethnographic practice. The chapter examines the potential for a unification of contemporary art practice with learner and teacher identities that have been marked as excessive to school. 8. Crisis and precarity, austere times for disability and art education. Examine the period between 2010 and 2020. Beginning with the emergence of the coalition government in Britain, it outlines the politics of austerity and the resulting precarity of disability and art education. The hostility experienced by education, and more specifically arts-based subjects, position them as excessive to an academic curriculum underpinned by an emphasis on STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering and maths. In addition to this, new training and management models in secondary schools in Britain reduce teacher autonomy and agency, making curriculum innovation and a deep understanding of pedagogy in art, craft and design appear as irrelevant. During these recent times, the lives of disabled people were worsened by political ideologies that continued to demonise those deemed to be unproductive. In particular, disabled children and young people were disproportionately impacted by cuts to provision, including educational support. In moving towards the EBAC, the English Baccalaureate, art education and pupils labelled with special educational needs became excessive to schools who were required to justify particular forms of academic performance within a highly competitive and regulated sector. Casting off. Advancing an anti-ableist pedagogy. Disabled and non-disabled artists, activists and academics and students demand innovative pedagogy and curriculum in art education. Aligning disability arts with contemporary arts practice enables the radical revisioning of individual and deficit-based ideologies. Such perspectives are underpinned by an ethical and moral commitment to valuing diverse human capacities for what they can teach us about learning. And I'm referencing some work by Dennis Atkinson in his work on a pedagogy of care. In a final word, I ask, what optimism is available, and how can a relationship between art education and disability foster hope? I find it here, where the alliance between disability studies and art education offers an essential reminder that we must value our ability to make good, and to believe that every mark counts. Cast off tightly using number 11 needles. Fasten off securely. Thank you.